I'm here to listen. Why am I walking on this way?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Muse's AT Podcast, where you can relive my epic journey with me. This is Muse, and what follows is my Appalachian Trail story. Today's episode covers Thursday, June 12th, 2025. A couple of things before I tee up the content of this episode. First, time has caught up with us. As this episode airs on Monday, June 15th, it is the first one to hit the airwaves over a year after the events it describes. And also, I've got a cool post-trail update. This one is specifically about Silly Putty. I've been introducing a lot of people, so to reintroduce, Silly Putty is my trail sister from my Slobo family and also the musician you guys hear every time you press play on this podcast. Her punk band, Slop Tart, has started doing shows again. You can search up Slop Tart on Spotify or YouTube, and on Trail, I listen to Silly Putty and her friends on both of those platforms. Also, in the show notes to this episode, you will find a YouTube link to her recent show in West Philly at the end of May. In our podcast today, we awaken at Cooper Brook Falls Lean-To and head out to Johnson Pond Road to get our food drop. This is a big day. We've talked a lot about food drop. After Katahdin, just getting to the food drop site is our first major landmark and goal. It's an accomplishment to get this far, 63 miles on the AT. Also, there are roads in the 100-mile wilderness, Johnson Pond Road being one of them. There's really just a couple, but they're old logging roads, so even the most established, like Johnson Pond, there's another one, Joe Mary Road, not far away from it at mile 56. Those ones feel like they're more established. There's actually gravel. A lot of these roads that you encounter in the wilderness, and again, there's only a handful of them, maybe 4 or 5 at most, are even overgrown with grass and kind of weeds covering over them and everything. So some of them may not even get that much use. Joe Mary Road, of course, I didn't mention it, but we would have passed that last episode. Today's haiku is a post-trail one, actually just from very recently, June 9th, 2026. It's time to wake up. Easy to fall back asleep. Life starts when dream ends. June 12th, 2025. Food drop. Start. Cooper Brook Falls Lean-To, Maine. End. East Branch Lean-To, Maine. Miles, 8.1. From Cooper Brook Falls, food drop was about 3 miles. There was a lot of activity and camaraderie around the shelter getting ready to go, but everybody seemed to be of about the same mind. Get there early and wait for food drop to show up, rather than just hitting the time. Haley and I were the last to arrive at the food drop from the Cooper Brook crew. We were making good time and stopped at a sandy beach on a lake for a while before completing the trek there. When we got there, Justin, David, and Chaps were playing cards, and everybody else was pretty much just waiting. Food drop was a lot of fun. Trash Panda and Loins of Arabia, husband and wife thru hikers that now run the AT hostel where we stayed in Millinocket, brought us our food drop that we set up when we were there. It was fun to see them again. And for a while after everyone was done organizing the stuff they just had to add to their packs, we just stood around and chatted. We got some additional wisdom from Trash Panda and Loins, but mostly it was just hanging out. It was pretty much everyone that had been at Cooper Brook, minus Fernando, who is done in Munson and got his food drop yesterday, organized through Shaw's Hiker Hostel there. That is most likely where we will stay in a little less than a week. An awesome thing that was mentioned while we were chatting. Squatch, who we met back in Millinocket, who works for the hostel, awesome guy, set the new fastest known time for going up and down Katahdin. I don't remember it precisely, but I believe it was just over 3 hours. That's crazy. Haley and I had learned when we were in town that Squatch is going for a record of number of times scaling the mountain in one season, current record being 27, and Squatch's goal is 30. This guy's a beast. He'll definitely do it. Congrats on the FKT, Squatch. Quick update on the knee. Even that minor swelling is gone. I honestly thought that recovery would be for Munson. I guess we didn't rest per se, but the trail was pretty easy for a couple of days there. All right, we're going to take a quick break to hear from the sponsors who help keep Muse's AT Podcast on the trail. These are offerings that truly enhanced my thru-hike experience, so I'd really like you to check them out. Please look for and follow the links in the show notes to this episode. Looking forward to that lazy day on the couch, knocking down your Netflix queue and wondering what to wear? Quick answer, wear something else. Summit Ready Apparel is clothing built for those who scramble over jagged rocks, reach the peaks, and actually enjoy getting caught in a torrential downpour. If you're someone who doesn't mind the elements and has the grit to crush the next segment anyway, look no further than Summit Ready to match your restless trail spirit. Check out the catalog at summitreadyapparel.com and get ready for your next adventure. That's summitreadyapparel.com. Looking for your next great trail read? Walk Uphill is a powerful story about leaving the emptiness of modern corporate life behind and finding a completely new beginning on the Appalachian Trail. It's about discovering what life can look like when you embrace freedom, lighten your load, and take it step by relentless step. I actually read this book myself during a couple rest days in Gorham, New Hampshire, right after conquering the brutal terrain of southern Maine. I literally couldn't put it down. I read it from cover to cover in 2 days. The book chronicles the real-life events of the author, Bounce the Hiker, in a twisty, shocking, edge-of-your-seat story that even the most imaginative fiction writer couldn't make up. Just a quick content warning, there is definitely adult material in this book, so I wouldn't recommend buying it for your 10-year-old's birthday. But if you're looking for a gripping, raw trail adventure, I highly recommend Walk Uphill by Bounce the Hiker. You can find it easily on Amazon by searching Walk Uphill Book, or just click the direct link in the show notes of this episode. And that, my friends, I've come to realize is the end of chapter 1 of this story. Now, I don't have chapter breaks in my outline or anything like that, but I think they may make themselves apparent as we go. At least this time it did. Maybe that's something that continues, maybe it's not. I guess we'll find out. Why I call that the end of chapter 1 is that we say goodbye to a couple people, and also a major concept here. So first, Fernando. And as you guys know from the couple of times I've mentioned it, that's not going to be a permanent goodbye in this Appalachian Trail story. We will see Fernando in a while as I enter Massachusetts, but that's in a different context. Fernando goes from fellow hiker to trail angel. And of course, we'll talk about that when we get there. The other goodbye is not only Trash Panda and Loins in Arabia personally, who we got sort of a little bit of a reunion with on this day, but also the concept of being under the care of the AT hostel. Because up until this point, it really kind of felt that way. In a way, as I think about a narrative arc here, the protagonist just grew up. We've now come to the point where we're getting turned loose and this hike is our own. And Trash Panda and Loins, they did a pretty cool thing here that as I look back on now, kind of commemorates that idea. Of course, their main purpose there was to bring us our stuff, and they did that. They brought us back our buckets that we sealed when we were back at the hostel, and we swapped out. We gave them all our trash, we took our food that we had reserved for ourselves, under their guidance. And then it was just a lot of chilling for a while. There was one guy there that I haven't even mentioned. I don't even remember his name, unfortunately. It was the only time I ever met him. He was kind of in and out. But the rest of us, which really made, as I mentioned in the entry, the whole Cooper Brook crew minus Fernando, we hung out for a good while. And Trash Panda and Loins of Arabia actually circled us up. And we kind of talked in the circle about like what we had experienced so far, what we were kind of hoping for. We continued to get some advice from 2 seasoned through hikers. And I don't remember much of this in specific. Actually, I do remember one thing, and that was that I had lost a tent peg. And I had lost a tent peg at Cooper Brook Falls. I'd gotten up that morning and just couldn't find it anywhere, despite, packing up my whole tent and everything. I'll be honest with you now, in retrospect, I'll go ahead and admit it. I actually thought Fernando accidentally took it, which could even be true. I'm not absolutely sure. When I brought that up in the circle, not even sure why that was the relevant thing that came to my head, I didn't bring up that I thought Fernando took it. I just brought up that I had lost it. Trash Panda just kind of shrugged and said, well, you can use a rock. And I was like, oh, cool. Well, I could use a rock. And I would end up using that little bit of passing advice, if you will, when I was in the whites later on tent platforms because stakes became useless. But we'll talk about that, of course, when we get there. So as we're kind of in the meta story a little bit already, I mentioned a chapter closing. Obviously, next episode we'll be kind of opening up a new one. I want to talk about narratively how I want to go forward from here, at least the next few episodes. I am going to speed up our remaining time in the wilderness. We would, from here, spend 4 more full days, and I don't want to go 4 more full episodes on the wilderness. This isn't me running out of things to say per se. It's just kind of a nod to the narrative concept of pacing. You guys, as the listeners, may kind of get into a point where you're like, man, we're still talking about the wilderness. And honestly, it might be worth sitting in that thought for just a moment, because I will say there was a point, not here on June 12th, but probably later, say maybe June 15th or so, when Haley and I kind of felt that way. We're still in the wilderness. When does this turn into anything else, right? Not that the wilderness wasn't awesome, because of course it was, and I think you've heard me say that a few times, but it is 100 miles long. So next 2 episodes, the remainder of this week, we are going to go ahead and double up. So next episode will cover the 13th and 14th, and the following episode will cover the 15th and 16th. And then next Monday, we're actually going to get an interview episode. Now, normally those have been every other Friday, but I like this interview timed where it was, and you guys will find out why. Timed where it was next Friday, but now I've just accelerated the timeline and taken essentially 2 episodes out. So interview next Monday right before we leave the 100-mile wilderness. Now, with the balance of this episode, kind of what I want to do is go into, well, maybe a couple of things. One of them is, though, the geography of the area around us. This was something that kind of came to my mind when I was talking to Margot Polo, and then I actually remember back to when I was talking to Wayfinder as well. And in both of those interviews, my guest was mentioning these place names that were immediately right around where we are here in the narrative. And I come to realize that while I've put some place names in the glossary section of some of the episodes, I've been leaving out a lot of the geography. So I really want to kind of fill that in a little bit, which might even serve to ground you just a little on some of the stuff that Margot Polo was talking about in Friday's episode. So I'm actually going to flip through far out here, and I know I owe you guys still a more comprehensive talk about what's in that app, because there's a lot in there. You guys have gotten the overview, though. It's the navigation app, and you can kind of pick a waypoint and sort of aim at it and everything. I know I've said all that. What I can do, even from my home here in North Carolina, is call up those waypoints and flip through them, just hitting this little next button here on the app, which is kind of cool. So right here on the podcast, I'm going to start in Katahdin Stream Campground, and I'm actually going to end when we get to Caratunk. And what that'll do is it will give you some of the geography up until this point, and some of the geography in our immediate future. And the reason I'm going to go all the way to the town of Caratunk is because a lot of what Margot Polo was saying on Friday was pretty specific all the way up till that point, and then some specifics after that point. But the other thing is Caratunk, even though it's past Munson, is kind of still in our fairly immediate future as well. So I think this might be helpful even for the go forward. Okay, so starting at Katahdin Stream Campground, we are at this point hiking the easiest 10 miles in all of Maine, as Trash Panda put it. And the first thing we're going to come to is Grassy Pond, and then as I flip forward just less than a mile away, I'm at the Dacey Pond East Shore. We actually track along Dacey Pond for a little bit. I think it's cool to take a look back through this and note the ponds, right? Because we're still in Baxter State Park at this point, but we've already come across 2 ponds. We're kind of hiking along Katahdin Stream. There's another stream that's going to come up here in just a minute, but that gives a sense at how much water there is. And I know I mentioned lakes and ponds before, but we are really surrounded by a ton of water in Maine. So after Dacey Pond, we come to a couple waterfalls. There's something called Little Niagara Falls and then Big Niagara Falls. And then we're going to come to a stream that I just can't pronounce at all. It starts with an N, ends with the syllable hunk, but Nezowadenhunk stream branch, the main stream, cross that one again, another waterfall, another small stream, and then the Katahdin Stream where we had camped by, and I kind of had just mentioned we hiked more or less parallel to all day. So this whole day that I'm describing now was June 7th, so a little bit in the past from where we are in our narrative. We quickly finished that day at Herd Brook Lean-To, just a little bit into the wilderness, and then we're immediately, that next day, onto Rainbow Ledges, and we're kind of in this rainbow section, if you will, right? We're going to quickly see Rainbow Lake. There's a Rainbow Mountain that's a little bit off the trail, actually 0.7 of a mile off the trail. And one thing about blue blazes that take you that far off the trail to a peak, I very quickly, and actually quickly enough that it was already the case here, I wasn't really taking those. I saw my fair share of mountain peaks that the trail went right over. So I really didn't go off trail for too many peaks. There were a couple along the way, but not too many. We go along Rainbow Lake for a good amount of time. It was a huge, huge lake. And we end that day, as you may remember, at the Rainbow Spring campsite. This was the day we met Fernando. The trail continues along Rainbow Lake, past Rainbow Deadwaters, past the Crescent Pond, past Wadley Pond Road, which I don't remember being a very significant road, and ultimately up onto Nezuntabunt Mountain. And you guys may remember Nezuntabunt being the mountain from where I called the hostel and rescheduled the food drop a couple more days out. And then we would ascend that mountain and end that day, June 9th, at the Wadley Stream Lean-To. And then we really get into these couple easy days that I just described in that entry. I said in this June 12th entry, today's entry, that we had just had a couple pretty easy days. We're going to pass a lot of water. We're next passing Namakanta Lake, which is even bigger than Rainbow Lake. So we walk along that for the better part of a day, maybe even 2 days here, taking us through Antlers Campsite around the west part of that lake. And then trail south actually goes north a little bit to Potawajo Spring Lean-To, where we ended June 11th. And then more water, Cooper Brook, Cooper Pond, Joe Mary Road, Cooper Brook Falls Lean-To, where we started here on the 12th. From there, south of Johnson Pond Road, trail south from the food drop, we're actually going to start to hit mountains. And here's where you heard Wayfinder even talk about some of the mountains that we would hit. First, we do come across the east branch of the Pleasant River. But from the east branch of the Pleasant, we're quickly ascending Whitecap Mountain, which you're going to hear about in next episode, which was kind of an emotional high point for both Haley and me. Go on to Hay Mountain, a west peak of that range, Gulf Haggis Mountain. We eventually come back down and hit the west branch of the Pleasant River right before we get into the Chairbacks. You heard Wayfinder talk about the Chairbacks as well. So the Chairback Range with its 3 peaks, and Chairback Pond, a couple different Chairback Ponds as we go through there. Past Barren Mountain to Big Wilson Stream, which is probably the one that Ratatouille got stuck at. If you remember all the way back to his episode, Big Wilson Stream could be a significant crossing. For Haley and I, it really wasn't, however, because at this point, we were before that big rainstorm, and we went through in a drought. I think it was about ankle deep. Little Wilson Stream, and we're getting close to being out of the 100 at this point. So we leave the 100-mile wilderness into the town of Munson. Leaving Munson then, still going trail south, you quickly get to the east and west branches of the Piscataquis River. And not too terribly far after that, but it's a couple mountains after that, and I'll come back to those mountains, the Moxie Pond Road and Ford. And it was the Piscataquis and Moxie Pond, the ford specifically, that Marco Polo was navigating during that same rainstorm that I just talked about, Ratatouille, was probably Big Wilson Stream. Haley and I, as you'll come to know, were actually chilling in the town of Munson at that point. So we didn't have these early rain stories that everybody else did. The 2 mountains that I skipped were Bald Mountain and Moxie Bald. And we've got just a little bit of water, one more mountain, Pleasant Pond and Pleasant Pond Mountain, and then we're in Caratunk, which is the next town after Munson. Really just 2 to 3 days of hiking between those two. And then Marco Polo also mentioned the Kennebec River. That is actually immediately on the west side of Caratunk. So proceeding south on the trail, you would cross the Kennebec right after leaving the town of Caratunk. The other place in Maine that Marco Polo brought up was Mahoosic Notch. Now that's a little further on into our future, so we won't kind of go all the way there, but we'll get there, when we get there. Hopefully that was helpful for you going through the geography like that, maybe even more helpful on the go forward, because as you start to hear these things in the entry, you'll have something to anchor it back to. So one thing I might do is start to do a sort of look forward geography wise, like I've been doing a look forward with the people I meet. Let me know what you think about that. As always, feedback is welcome. Hit me at either Muse Hikes on Instagram or museatpodcast@gmail.com with anything you might want to say about that. The other thing that I wanted to do, and this is coming from my talk with Marco Polo as well, is talk about the people that she brought up, because there was a lot of overlap and a lot of names that you guys have heard before. So maybe we'll hit this kind of rapid fire. First, she mentioned the triplets. Now, we haven't mentioned the triplets before, but I half wonder if that might be the twins that I ran into at the barn hostel. But there's some timeline inconsistencies there, so that might not be the case. But there are a couple twins that we'll meet at the barn. There's also this guy, Jackrabbit. Now, this would be a total timeline inconsistency that we could work out later. But there was a gym teacher that I met in Connecticut, and I named him Jackrabbit. So I wonder if that maybe he fits a little later in Margot's story and this is the same guy I named or just a completely different guy. It'd be kind of funny if it was the same guy. Okay, some folks that we have heard these names before. So we ran into Daddy Longlegs, Frogger, and Pastor Frank at Trail Days. And Daddy Longlegs we've actually already run into on trail as well. You heard me talk about her as we entered the 100-mile wilderness. And then Margot also talked about Won't Get Up Will. Now, Won't Get Up Will we've talked about as well. She was at the AT Hostel with us, and then we'll actually meet Won't Get Up Will a couple more times on this journey, first time being in Munson. And then the last one that I want to mention and maybe even give a little shout out to is Slurpee, because when I first mentioned Slurpee, it was in the context of he's one of the guys who was on Katahdin with me on June 5th. Now, one thing I want to maybe clarify is another thing I said in that same episode was that I thought I was the only one on Katahdin on June 5th that made it to Springer last season. And that may even still be true, but Slurpee did something that I didn't even fully realize what he was doing. He flipped from somewhere in Virginia, I believe, all the way down to Key West on the Florida Trail and started hiking north. So anyway, by now, Slurpee's been up and over Springer because I think he's probably finishing right about now, which will be what I called when I was talking to Margot Polo, 2 legs of the ECT. Now, the ECT, the Eastern Continental Trail, goes from Key West all the way up into Canada, and the Appalachian Trail constitutes like the middle third of that, which is why I called it what I did. Regardless of that definition, that means that Slurpee has probably, again, right about the time this episode hits, connected all the way from Key West to Katahdin, which is just awesome. So shout out to Slurpee for that. Major congratulations. And on that high note, I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap this episode up. For the rest of the week, we're going to do those 2 double headers that I talked about, picking up our pace through the retelling, at least, of the 100-mile wilderness. We'll have an interview episode next Monday, and then leave the 100-mile wilderness next Wednesday. With all that, until next time, this has been Muse, and you have been listening to Muse's AT Podcast. Thank you for walking with me, and happy trails.